We're starting to get a good idea of what's on lawmakers' to-do lists for the session, but how well does that line up with what Idahoans care about? Joining me to discuss the most recent Boise State Public Policy Survey is Dr. Matthew May and Dr. Lantz McGinnis-Brown. Dr. May, let's start with you. How do Idahoans feel about what track Idaho is on?
Generally, Idahoans have a much more optimistic view of the direction of the state this year compared to last year. About 49% think that we're headed in the right direction now. This is the first time we've seen an increase in that proportion since 2018, and the gap is between right direction and wrong track is the largest it's been since the last several years, and we're outside of the margin of error for the first time in 3 years. So generally, there's a sense of optimism coming from Idahoans.
How does that vary depending on different factors, like how long Idahoans have lived in the state, for example?
Generally, longtime Idahoans were a little bit, those who have lived in the state for more than 10 years were a little bit more likely to say that we are off on the wrong track than newcomers were, and newcomers were a little bit more likely to say that we're headed in the right direction, which tracks since there's had to be something that attracted them to come to the state in the first place.
And I imagine that also varies depending on political affiliation.
100%. Definitely Republicans tend to favor the right direction answer by a substantial margin. And at the same time, Democrats favor the wrong track answer by an equally substantial margin. Independents were a little bit in the middle, just very narrowly skewing towards wrong track by about 3 points.
How about policy priorities? What do Idahoans want lawmakers to focus on?
So there are two major priorities we were able to glean from the results this year. First, in a general sense, education remains the #1 legislative priority, and it has consistently ranked top of our survey results going back 10 years. So Idahoans are definitely unified in wanting to see something in education. Now, what that actually looks like kind of depends upon who you ask specifically. When we ask about a budget priority, the #1 answer was increasing teacher salaries, but there were a range of other options just underneath that. In terms of an overall legislative budget priority, workforce and affordable housing was the top answer for the second consecutive year. It's down 6 points from where it was last year, but it's still maintained a large proportion of Idahoans' priorities.
And Dr. McGinnis-Brown, when we talk about the nitty-gritty of those education policy concerns, what did you see?
Yeah, so we asked folks specifically what their top K-12 public school budget priority might be, and the top response by far was teacher salaries, and that was the top response regardless of party. But you did see some more disagreement among Republicans. It was the top response for Republicans, but Republicans were also more likely to say allowing tax dollars to be used for private or religious education, while Democrats and independents were more likely to say buildings and facilities is the second choice.
And when we talk about whether we call it school choice or public dollars going to private education choices, there was also, as you mentioned, a difference in political party, what people favored versus what they opposed.
Yeah, and we followed up on the budget question with a question specifically about, do you support or you oppose the use of tax dollars to help pay for a private or religious education if a parent chooses not to send their child to a local public school? This relates to a lot of discussion around school choice, but we wanted to avoid that terminology since it can mean so many different things and really focus on the nitty-gritty of the language as we were aware of it. What we found there is that a little more than half of folks oppose, with 37% strongly opposing, while 38% are in support to some degree or another. But of course, you do have a strong party divide, so Republicans are about 40 points more likely to support.
And you touched on this, but there are so many different things that school choice can mean. It can mean charter schools. It can mean within a public school district sending your child to an elementary school where you don't live in the zone. It can mean public tax dollars going to support homeschool. Do you think that those responses might have been different had there been a specific policy proposal or a different choice in language?
One thing we found last year is we asked a slightly different question, and we followed up by asking specifically if you thought that this proposal would affect, help, or hurt public school budgets, would that make you more in support or less in support? And what we found is that if it hurt public schools, support would go down significantly. What that really shows is that school choice, the details of the policy really have a major impact on people's attitudes about it and their willingness to support it.
Sure, absolutely, as with so many different things. What did Idahoans say about Idaho's current abortion ban?
We asked 2 questions about abortion access. The first question was about the abortion timeline, ranging from total prohibition to within the first 6 weeks, first trimester, fetal viability, 22 to 24 weeks, and no restrictions. Again, not surprisingly, you see a major partisan split on this. So the top response among Republicans was completely prohibited, with about a third of Republicans. But the top response among Democrats and independents was no restrictions. More than half of Democrats, about a third of independents. When you combine those responses, stacking more permissive onto less, what we find is, crossing the majority threshold, 55% of overall respondents want to allow abortion access at least through that first trimester.
How about exceptions for the health of the mother? Because that's been the subject of so many court cases and also a lot of discussion among physicians and women.
Yeah. We followed up on our timeline question with a question specifically about exceptions, ranging from no exceptions to only allowing for documented cases of rape, incest, life of the mother, to including health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies, and finally, no restrictions again. Again, we find a partisan split, so the top response for Republicans and independents was actually to include the health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies, while the top response for Democrats was, again, no restrictions. Again, stacking more permissive responses onto less, what we find is, crossing that majority threshold, 64% of respondents want to include at least documented cases of rape, incest, death of the mother, and health of the mother and non-viable pregnancies as exceptions.
Right, there is so much more in this public policy survey. We'll make sure to link to it at idahoreports.org. Dr. Lantz McGinnis-Brown, Dr. Matthew May, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.